Hello there, I'm Leo Waldop for KitGuru, and this case is the InWin 703. I don't begin to understand the model codes that InWin uses, so 703 could mean practically anything. However, in this instance, it means relatively basic PC tower that accommodates an ATX motherboard. There is a bigger version of this case which I'll be reviewing in the near future, which is the 707, and that's an eATX model. So this 703 ATX sells for a few pennies under £55. In the UK, for the first few months of the year, it's going to be exclusively sold through Box, and they're going to use it for system builds. And I haven't seen any of the systems that use the 703. My guess is going to be they're going to be relatively basic, relatively budget PCs. And the reason I say that is that to me is what this case is all about. You've got one of the two best views of this case, which is the windowed panel. If I turn to the front, you've got the other best view of it, which is the front panel. Both very smart, minimalist, straightforward, look the part, show off your PC to its best effect. These are good things. If I just pull off the two side panels, the back panel, I've removed the two thumb screws. They're not captive thumb screws. The back panel is just plain steel, flexes a little bit. You have to locate it and shove it in, and you're pulling it off using the the curve. I noticed when I was taking photos of this case that the paint is rubbing off this panel, and this case is almost new. I've used it for a system build, I've done some testing, I've moved it around a little bit. It's not been abused. I didn't notice the paint wearing when it came out of the box, so I'm assuming it's happened while I've been using it, and I'm really surprised. I've taken care of this case, and yet the paint is wearing. If we go to the windowed panel, and again pull using the sort of projection, again two thumb screws, not captive. The windowed panel is held on with these Allen screws, which looks the part, very neat, very secure, and it means you don't have that sort of yucky double-sided tape or sort of spray adhesive that certain companies use. I like that. It probably cost me a few pennies. It looks the part, it looks kind of engineered and intentional. It's worth mentioning, by the way, when you look at the back of the motherboard tray, that there is almost no space for cable management. Essentially, the motherboard tray and the side of the chassis are flush, and the space that you have for cables is actually this sort of alcove in the motherboard, in the side panel. That is the space you have to work with, and there's not a lot of it. My guess is that InWin doesn't consider this to be a problem because they assume you're going to use a power supply that doesn't have a great many connections. The power supply will be carefully chosen for the system you're building. It's not going to be an all singing or dancing model and you've got bunches of extra connectors free. It's going to be sized to the system. You'll have the bare minimum of cables, therefore very little to feed up this sort of channel here, and therefore very little to tuck away down the bottom. At the front of the case, you have a 120mm fan, and you have a rear 120mm fan as well. This is the 120 fan that comes with the system, which I've removed because I put this Alpenphone Wasser 120mm liquid cooler in its place, so the fan's in the same location that this one came in. This is illuminated with 4 LEDs, red LEDs. It looks very nice and it's spinning away. I took it out partly because I just don't like fans that are powered with a 4-pin Molex connector. Fans, to my mind, should be powered by motherboard header, PWM through a 4-pin. This, to me, is very oldie worldy, and I don't much like it. It does, of course, mean your power supply is obliged to have at least one Molex connector, which isn't a problem, but after all, if you're using a modular supply, you've probably got the motherboard connections, graphics cards, and SATA. You may well not have a Molex connector available. But anywho, so the front and rear fans both use a 4-pin connector, but you can stack them. So you only need the one coming from your power supply. So I'm not mad keen on that. And of course it means you can't then control the speed in the BIOS because the fans are invisible to the BIOS. So not keen on that. It's worth pointing out that you get quite a lot of space for the graphics card. This Sapphire R9290 Trix card, there's plenty of space available for it to come further forward. InWin tells us that it can accommodate a graphics card up to 408mm in length. Also, CPU cooler, it says up to 170mm, which basically means any sort of tower cooler that uses a 120 fan Quite possibly there are some on the market that use a 140 that was squeezed in there, but I don't think that's the case. So if it's got a 120 fan, almost certainly you're good unless it's some badly designed monster. Realistically, they're not expecting you to use a liquid cooler. However, as I've shown, you can easily put it in the position I have with the radiator and fan at the rear of the chassis. It's worth pointing out, incidentally, that where I've done that install, that the screws here were actually overlapped by the flange on the side panel. Unlike the sort of standard teeny little screws, these are slightly larger. So it's all a bit... But it works well enough, and I personally think that's neater than an air cooler, but on that one you pay your money, it takes choice. You are not, with this chassis, realistically going to remove the front fan. There is a second housing for a second 120 fan. You are realistically not going to remove that fan, open up the 240mm space and put a liquid cooler in that place, because the drive tower here is fixed, so you are basically stuck with that. We've got 4 drive caddies which come out, which are sort of flexi plastic, and you put either a 2.5 or a 3.5 inch drive in there and slide it home. So nothing too inspired or exciting there. Common sense is you feed the cables out of the back to keep it all a bit neater, but well, you almost have to actually with this layout. So there's that. As I say, fixed drive tower. However, you do also have one SATA bay on top of there, so you could put your SATA drive in there if you wish it to, so your SSD rather, if you want it to be more sort of visual and on show in the window. Matter of choice. Slightly annoying to see the drive tower fixed. However, the space there is sort of dead, but it does of course mean that any cooling at the bottom is more or less going to be obstructed by that. What else? Yes, there is one optical drive bay at the front, and I noticed or noted that the blank for that is actually quite black in colour, unlike this sort of charcoal grey. I can't decide in my own mind whether InWin is incapable of making a blank that matches the panel, or if it's actually a sort of a strategic styling decision, such that you do actually get a bit of a contrast. And I actually quite like the cases it's supplied, but the fact that the colours didn't match, it could have been just a mistake. It might have been an intentional decision. I'm not least bit clear. Despite appearances, by the way, the front panel is all plastic. The rest of the design is steel. On the back of the motherboard tray, we have very few cabling tie-down points. But the fact they've actually put a couple over here is almost excessive, because the chance you're going to feed cables over here going to, well, where exactly, seems unlikely to me. But that's just one of those curious things. You could do with more cable tie-down points either side of this channel that the cables have to go up. But other than that, there's not a lot they can do on the back of the chassis. You probably can't see along the top of this front panel we have 2 USB 2, 1 USB 3 headset jacks, and it's not the least bit obvious, but that is the power button, and there is no reset button. So minimalist, compact, smart. When you get up close and personal, it is actually quite cheap and cheerful, but it does a reasonable job. Building the PC into this chassis, I used an ASRock Z87 Extreme 4 motherboard, Core i7 processor, the Alpenfern liquid cooler as mentioned, and this Sapphire R9290 Trix graphics card. Down the bottom, I used a Seasonic Platinum 520 watt passive power supply, purely because I like the quiet of it. However, I cannot think for a second that anybody building a system into this case is going to be spending the sort of money required for the Seasonic in particular, even though it would be money well spent, because I am certain that they're going to be going for budget. Possibly well chosen components, but I would have thought they'd be heading towards cheap, hopefully value, but certainly cheap. This chassis is £55, and to my mind, or a few pennies under, it makes sense to use it as it comes. You use the stock rear fan, the stock front fan, put an air cooler on your CPU, mess around with it to the bare minimum. Realistically, modding opportunities for this chassis are just none. There's nothing you can do here. The front panel is as it comes. Actually, let me just unclip this. It's slightly annoying to me that the front panel is actually sort of held by the snake of cables that comes from these ports. But if I just do this and then lift it, and you actually get a look at what's going on underneath with these mesh covers for the front fan and the empty housing. So you can, it filters the air and it can be easily cleaned. However, I much prefer it if the front panel ports are attached to the case rather than to the front panel. It just makes it easier to move things around. There's filters at the bottom, and we also have filter. I thought there was another filter. Perhaps not. Perhaps the rear is unfiltered. It makes obviously sense to install liquid cooler as I did at the rear, even if I could have put it at the front, which realistically would have been blooming hard work. It makes sense to do it at the rear so the air flows through and out. So there we have it. As far as I can see, box building systems into the 703 makes perfect sense, provided they're fairly budget systems, because this is not a case for the enthusiast. Modders will find nothing to interest them here. I would imagine that if you've owned a PC and you think it's time to do your own serious upgrade, or possibly build your own first PC, you might think this is a good choice. And it's not a bad choice, but it offers you far fewer options than NZXT, Fantex and others, and indeed many cases from InWin. That's the interesting thing here. We know for a fact that InWin knows how to build chassis. In the accessories, you get a few odds and ends, such as rubber washers to silent mount the hard drives. You also get a couple or three extra motherboard standoffs, because the motherboard actually sort of mounts on bumps on the motherboard tray. So I had to put one standoff in place. However, InWin does supply one of those little installation tools for the motherboard standoffs. They know what they're doing to InWin, no two ways about it. In this case, they have kept it really basic. This is a case that looks the part, that's intended for system builders who can bung a motherboard in double quick, whop in a graphics card, cooler, and you're pretty much ready to go. Whether or not you have an optical drive is another matter. But you're not going to mess around with the cooling, that's the thing, and you're going to use an air cooler. So in with the motherboard assembly, stick in a drive, you're good, next. You could do the same thing at home. The question is why you'd bother. £55 including VAT is relatively cheap, but it's not free of charge. I mean, if it was £40, it'd be an absolute bargain. £55 is some money, and the thing is, we know that for £80 you can get stacks and stacks of stuff. Cases that have all sorts of options for cooling and power supply cover, and you can remove drive bays, move it all around, make it look absolutely gorgeous. This case gives you that initial, I like that. The front panel, the window are good. That's about as good as it gets. The amount of space you have available for cable management is the bare minimum. However, every aspect of this case works. Many aspects of it I don't like. For example, the Molex connector on the fans. I don't like that. And I don't quite understand why they've done it, unless the thinking is that the sort of motherboard that's going to go in a case like this just doesn't have many fan headers. If any fan headers, it has the one for the CPU and that's it, i.e. really basic models. So InWin is catering for a market that very likely is not you. InWin is catering to the small system builder that wants a case that looks attractive, that's more than just a beige tower, and it does a reasonable job. And that's all great. I like that idea, but it's not something I'll be using myself. And I suspect neither would you, because KitGuru readers are enthusiasts. And this, while it looks the part, isn't really an enthusiast product. It is, however, a very reasonable product that fits a certain niche in the market, which is the basic system that you've bought from a small system builder. So I look forward to seeing systems using this case, but I shouldn't be building one myself, and I doubt you will either. This is Leo Walder for KitGuru, and this is the InWin 703.